Hello, folks. Welcome back to World War II TV and the second of our double bill today. And while the Allies were pushing into Germany over the Rhine, 8,136 miles away in Burma, or Myanmar as it is now, Indian troops were attacking the Japanese across the Irrawaddy River bridgehead. Jack Bowsher rejoins us to talk about the amazing feat of arms that he's going to explain in detail to us. He is the author of two books. The second one is not out yet, so I can't hold that up. Their first book, of course, is Forgotten Armor, and then Thunder Run is coming out later this year, I think in June. And there's full links to Jack's podcast, personal website, publisher's website in the description below. So there we are, plugs done. Good evening, Jack. How are you today?
Yeah, I'm wonderful. Thank you very much for having me back on, Paul. Nice to see everyone as well.
Good to have you back. So we're going to dive straight into this. But before we do, with the podcast, bringing that attention back to Burma, you and Rob Lyman, can we, at what point, I think we discussed this on the panel, can we say that Burma isn't forgotten? Maybe less talked about, but there are people like yourself making headway now, trying to get the word out there. There's been comics and stuff set in the theater. There's been TV coverage. Do you think you'll lose the forgotten war tag at some point? The unforgotten, the not talked about enough, but not forgotten war.
Yeah, that's what we'll have to change it to in a couple of years' time, perhaps. Yeah, I mean, generally speaking, I think it will always be the sort of the ugly duckling to the European theatre at the end of the day. I don't think that will ever go. And there are, I get it. There are very good reasons. The proximity is by far the most obvious reason. Nazi Germany is a much more explicit threat. So and Trevor, almost as forgotten as Tunisia. But this is the thing, you mentioned Tunisia, but with African Stalingrad and so on. So long as people champion these causes, that's actually what changes it. And I suppose calling things like the podcast the Forgotten War Pod is as much about trying to change that anyway. The whole point is hopefully it would be perhaps an ironic name one day in the future.
Yeah, that would be good, wouldn't it? So, well, you've come on with your slides and stuff. So, folks, you know the score. Jack's been on before. We've done this a few times before. So I'm going to hand over to Jack to talk about this. So it's 80 years ago, and we talk about 1944 as being a busy time, but the spring of 45 was also incredibly busy. Multiple fronts the Allies are fighting on. Logistics are there's still a concern, but we're maybe over the hump, pun intended, in terms of that part of the world. So I'm gonna hand over to you, Jack.
Yeah, wonderful, thank you. So this is Thunder Run, Meiktila, 1945, and if we could trust that we wouldn't get sued, I'd have probably come on to Thunderstruck as well by AC/DC. I've used that to psych myself up for today's talk because, it just has come along perfectly with the sort of the title of this. And for those that don't already know, my sort of like, what's the word? My inspiration for this particular book, the talk and so on, Thunder Run, is because I was studying my master's and we were doing the 2003 invasion of Iraq. We were doing the Thunder Run to Baghdad, obviously probably the most that is where the phrase comes from effectively. And we were studying in my master's course that, and then at the same time Putin invaded Ukraine, and then there was the famous footage. I don't know if people remember, but the long tailbacks of logistical, all the lorries and all that sort of stuff, and the Russians, were getting bogged down. They didn't really have their logistics sorted out, and they were able to be picked off by the Ukrainians. And the third sort of part to this, so 2003 Thunder Run to Baghdad, then Putin's attempted invasion, that his attempted Thunder Run to Kyiv essentially is what it was, and then you've got I was preparing for my dissertation that became my last book, Forgotten Armor, and so I was studying tank warfare in Burma, and it made me realise that the Meiktila 1945 story is effectively a Thunder Run, and that's where I've come across, because if anyone's got Forgotten Armor, I do a chapter on Meiktila and Mandalay as well. And that story was so good, and I only looked at it from the side of tanks in that book. And this is now the much wider story of the whole thing. And it's not just Meiktila as well, as we're going to see perhaps now, that this is more than just the story of Meiktila itself. It is primarily that story, but I chose to begin all of this really from the end of the Battle of Imphal. So let's get started into the actual thing. So first of all, where's Meiktila? These guys have only just worked out exactly where it is. They've had to pull over and stare at a small sign for a very long time to read the one word Meiktila, 2 miles. So that's basically us right now. Where's Meiktila? Well, let's have a look at it on a map. Here we go. So Meiktila is right in the middle and slightly to the right of the central Burmese plain. Now, unlike the sort of the famous jungle and so on that we associate, along the banks of the Chindwin, the Chin Hills, the Naga Hills, and also in the south in the sort of the Irrawaddy Delta, closer to the sort of the Bay of Bengal, and also in Arakan, it's all thick jungle, mountains, and so on. Here on the central plain in Burma, what we're talking about is almost desert-like conditions. In some places, it's a bit hilly, but it's rolling hills. This is what most people would have called tank country, tankable country back then. Now, they are found actually later when they actually get there that it's not quite as tankable as they hoped, but it's still pretty good. The Thunder Run, then, I've given you the map at the top right-hand side, and it's a bit annoying, actually. I just realised it's chopped the Irrawaddy weirdly as I've uploaded it. But the Irrawaddy River, then, is in a bend in the river where the Thunder Run takes off, and it's just after they've crossed the Irrawaddy that this all takes place. Now, I'm going to come back to this map with the Thunder Run itself. But Meiktila itself, as well, in the middle of this dry zone, is actually by 2 lakes, a North Lake and a South Lake, that are... and Meiktila sort of sits sort of roughly on the bit in between the two. And this is sort of like an irrigation area. There's a railway that runs through it, as well as a series of canals. And this is why Meiktila is so important. Meiktila is a supply hub for the Japanese. That's why they will go for it. Everything that arrives into the Burma area comes through there. So if you think of your Far East prisoners of war who are building the Thai-Burma Railway, the bridge over the River Kwai and so on, that railway comes into Meiktila. The other way is also from Rangoon, all of the railways from Rangoon that come to the north. So all of the supplies go up to Meiktila and then they fan back out across the rest of the country, just as one of those easy ways to get their supplies around. It makes it a target. Meiktila is regularly bombed from 1943, but the quantity of a big raid in sort of late 1944, early 1945 on Meiktila, you're talking about maybe 2 squadrons of bombers, like B-24s. Right. This is nothing on what's happening in that's obviously happening in Europe at the time. Let's move it on, though. So let's talk about some of our key characters. Now, these aren't the only key characters, but obviously Bill Slim, 14th Army Commander, Haitaro Kimura of the Burma Area Army, and again, sorry, that's chopped it off when I've uploaded this, but Burma Area Army, and also Misaki Honda of 33rd Army. There is also the 15th Army is involved, and to a degree, 28th Army. The whole of Burma Area Army is part of this, but really it's Honda is the key commander at Meiktila, and so is David Punch Cowan. These are the main characters really on the leadership front. So we're going to come to these guys quite a lot. Kimura versus Slim at the army level, and Honda and Cowan down at the battlefield level. The divisional and like army divisional level. So here we go. This is the build up to it. I mentioned that, I really think of this whole campaign, the Reconquest campaign begins with the end of the Battle of Imphal. So as most of you are probably aware, the Battle of Imphal is alongside Kohima, obviously, the twin battles of Imphal and Kohima. They are some of the great ways of showing, it shows you the destruction that happens to the Japanese. Yep. They are crippled at Imphal and Kohima, and they retreat back, but it's a fighting retreat. And so, I start really with pushing the Japanese out, because they fight tooth and nail in the Chin Hills in particular, down a couple of different routes. They eventually then cross the Chindwin at a place called Kalewa. And it's at Kalewa, when they just begin the drive to Mandalay, that Kimura does something that Slim does not expect. Kimura has fought tooth and nail, like I said, from Imphal to Kalewa. It's been a slow advance through the monsoon, and they reach Kalewa just after the monsoon has finished. That's when they build the famous Bailey Bridge as well, which at the time at 1,300 yards was the longest one in the world. It was not yards, feet, 1,300 feet, and this was the sort of going to be the supply line for the attack on Mandalay, which was the assumption that Slim had. I'll be attacking Mandalay. The problem is that as they're building this bridge, they actually Haitaro Kimura, he withdraws his army from the sort of the north and the west of Mandalay. He crosses them backwards across the Irrawaddy, which is, which is much more unexpected. Like I said, they expected to fight tooth and nail all the way to Mandalay. So Kimura withdrawing behind the Irrawaddy is a surprise. Slim was hoping to fight this big army battle using his tanks and artillery to destroy them before the Irrawaddy. Now he's got to cross the Irrawaddy with the Japanese army near enough intact. The massive casualties to 15th Army at Imphal and Kohima notwithstanding. An important part about this story is the fact that there are nearly 30,000 Japanese troops arrive, mostly from China, to reinforce the 15th Army in particular, but other casualties as well. So it's not like after Imphal and Kohima, the Japanese are broken. They are not the same troops as the year before, and certainly not 2 years before that in 1942, when it really was the sort of the cream of the Japanese army, or at least they were very, very effective, much more effective. So this is not, a bit like the German army, that the quality wanes as the war continues, essentially, due to the attrition. Kimura has retreated behind the Irrawaddy. Slim now has to decide, how do I destroy the Burma area army if I can't do it where I planned? I've now got to make a crossing. And he wants to make sure that whatever he does next, he wants to make sure that he traps the Japanese where they are. He doesn't want them withdrawing again, for example, into the jungles of southern Burma. He would like to keep them on the central dry plain, again, because he has the advantage in tanks and mobility, air power, all of those things. They will work much better on that central dry belt than they will in any jungle anywhere.
Yeah. As we've talked about, people like Phil Bradley and yourself, in the jungle is a reducer of the advantage of superior numbers, isn't it? It becomes down to the people at the front of the trail and the tank at the front of the unit. So it's if you, as Slim has these assets, you want to bring them all to bear. This is exactly the same as what's happening in the ETO. Why the allies have wanted to use main roads and bring up all their big stuff, because they've got it and they want to use it.
Yeah. And again, a bit like that, the Japanese are completely relying on things like almost First World War style Ilan, the Code of Bushido, and all these things that will, that will be of a greater advantage in the open to the British. So the British will counter that in the open more easily, because the Japanese light infantry tactics have an advantage in the cover that the jungle provides. So there's a couple of things here I'm just going to mention, because I want to try and personalize a lot of our a lot of the stories that I involve here. So one of the people that I sort of follow is this guy, John Nunnally. So John Nunnally was one of the guys. He lived to a very ripe old age, into the early noughties off the top of my head, and he was one of the officers in the 11th East African Division. So he's in charge of these Tanganyikan soldiers, and some of them are Kenyan as well, but it's primarily a Tanganyikan unit. And it's really those small infantry tactics. He's taking small groups of soldiers out on patrols, finding the Japanese. And one of the things that he notices is that thing I'm talking about. He's talking about the reinforcements that are arriving. So at the beginning of his 36 King's African Rifles going south into the Kabul Valley after Imphal, the Japanese quality of soldiers begins to rise compared to what they had. They're no longer fighting the people that had failed at Imphal, but the reinforcements. They begin to find guys who have clearly been recently well fed, people who have got fresher uniforms, that sort of thing. Japanese resistance begins to strengthen. And then after this point, I meant to mention this guy as well, because this is an interesting one for listeners. Jonathan Tregonning. So you've had John on, haven't you? John, yeah. So his grandfather was Donald Dixon, who built the bridge over the Chindwin that follows the African divisions, the 11th East African divisions advance down the Kabul Valley. And a lot of the East African units help Donald Dixon build that bridge. It's not just Indian army sappers, but also the East Africans help as well. So he talks about this sort of like in some letters that John actually sent me. It was really kind of him. He got in touch when he knew that I was writing about this and said, do you want to see my granddad's letters? Really, really amazing thing. Like I said, really, really long one, long bridge. But yeah, I'll carry on, because after the Kalewa and going down the Kabul Valley, you then have Slim's master stroke. What he does was, when he crosses over the Chindwin and he realizes that he's, that Kimura withdraws behind the Irrawaddy, that he wants to trap the Japanese up in that central plain. So his plan is to send down the Gangor Valley, which is the sort of the vertical part of the red arrow that I've shown, the Gangor Valley, using the Lashai Brigade. Now, the Lashai Brigade, and this is Philip Marinden, who is in charge of them, and then a Lashai scout sergeant, although obviously you can see he's not got any insignia on. They are the local people. They were long-range penetration. They end up doing 11 months. They were 11 months on sort of long-range penetration, longer than, say, like the Chindits and so on. They're really quite exhausted at this point, but they're just in the perfect position geographically at the beginning of this. This is Gangor. This is Gangor, Darren, in the Gangor Valley. And Slim is using this as a secret advance, and he's using the Lashai Brigade because they're already in the area. If he starts rotating units and so on, what he's worried about is that Slim's secret move is going to be uncovered. Well, Slim's secret move is you send the Lashai Brigade, and there are other units as well, but primarily the Lashai Brigade. They go south down this valley as the spearhead, but Slim is using 4 Corps. All his soldiers that have come south from Imphal, he's sending them behind the Lashai Brigade, including the tanks of 255th Indian Brigade. He absolutely does not want to have the Japanese know the strength of what is coming down this valley, hence why he uses the Lashai Brigade to screen that advance. Now, what we do is we make sure that we have this unit that's already in the area covering the advance and so on. Now, the problem for this is when the Lashai Brigade come to Gangor. Now, Gangor is a small village, which now is really considered one large one. And it was made up of 3 different areas. So Myorkon, and I've put on the modern map old, and old, because, just so that we know that they're not the same places. They're now just all considered Gangor. It's one single place. So Myorkon is not a name that's used for that locality. And Myorkon was basically a European settlement, and the Gangor and West Gangor were actually they were more like local ones that had grown up on the trade that was going down this river, the Myanmar River. Now, Gangor is this small little settlement, but at Myorkon there is a ridge over a chung just before you get to the village, and it's not easy to tell. Unfortunately, guys, if you're not in full screen, it'll be harder. But basically, at the top of the map, it's harder to see on the drawn map, which is from the Lashai Brigade's war diaries as well, by the way. There is like a line of a chung, and basically, this is an area, Gangor, where the Japanese have got. They decide to make something of a stand here rather than keep falling back. And what happens is he sends the Lashai Brigade and he splits it up in multiple different directions to encircle Gangor. The thing is, though, the Lashai Brigade were created to be a lightweight, light-moving force. And so when he actually sends them, they don't quite have the firepower that they need. So there is some criticism of the Lashai Brigade, which is I do think maybe a little bit harsh. They'd been operating behind Japanese lines since the beginning of the Japanese invasion of India. They're 11 months. This is into January 1945 now, but they have reached Gangor in December, so they spend nearly a month fighting for this area. And because Slim is so scared to actually use his heavy weapons, they do a couple of things. They do what they call an earthquake minor bombing raid. So they actually send a huge bombing raid in to try and sort of break the position. Has some success, but they also then eventually bring up some 25-pounders from 4 Corps, specifically 7th Indian Division. So Slim is beginning to show his hand, but not quite. He can get away with, maybe a battery or 2 of 25-pounders. He takes the risk, basically. And eventually they reduce the position. But they're all still really, really concerned that, are they telegraphing this? That's the constant fear here, that the Japanese discover what's going on. But they don't, or at least not noticeably so, and certainly Kimura doesn't do anything. And then that brings us to the crossing of the Irrawaddy itself. And again, I'm slightly skipping over a couple of important stories. There is a little bit of fighting with the Japanese, and eventually at just outside Pakoku, which you can just about see, there's a red dot just above it on the map. Pakoku is the most obvious crossing point, and they can't leave the Japanese garrison in there. And so Slim finally unleashes the 116th Gordon Highlanders, the tank regiment, on Pakoku, because he doesn't intend to use them for the Thunder Run. So he attacks Pakoku, captures it. He's finally used tanks and his heaviest weapons. Now, this particular thing, though, and I've seen, Bullet Tooth Tony, you've read the quote and how good this quote is. This is absolutely exactly what he's talking about here, really, even if he doesn't say this is what he's talking about. You'll notice the dates that all of this takes place. Now, Slim is desperate, like I said, not to really telegraph what his plan is with this left hook that's come down the Gangor Valley. He does not want the Japanese to withdraw. What he's done is, at the beginning of all of this, and in January, the 19th Indian Division has crossed the Irrawaddy much further north of Mandalay. And, they've just had a little bridgehead. They've kind of crossed a little bit too early. And Pete Rees, the leader, the divisional commander of 19th Division, he's a fantastic character. But he's the Battle of Mandalay. And obviously I'm focused on Meiktila. But, if anyone's read Forgotten Armour, one of my favourite chapters was talking about Pete Rees at Mandalay, because he is such a brilliant character. But he's crossed first in January. So the big thing here is Slim is desperate for the Japanese to think Mandalay is the target. Now, this is fairly easy in some respects. Mandalay is the place that most British people have heard of. So it's an obvious propaganda coup if you capture it. Mandalay is also somewhere that is sort of the first big town in the Central Plain. So again, seems obvious to capture it next. And then you then have the issue of, if I can draw the Japanese up into Mandalay, keep them in Mandalay, when I go south to this place called Meiktila, the supply hub, most of the Japanese army will be trapped at Mandalay. But the Japanese will have to attack Meiktila, otherwise it will wither. It won't be getting its supplies, or at least its supplies will be, hampered and delayed. To make sure that Slim actually manages to do all of this is by having these multiple crossings of the Irrawaddy in multiple places. And the dates are important. So remember, the first one I mentioned was the 19th Division in the middle of January. They cross over far to the north of Mandalay. Slim wants them to think Mandalay is the target. So that's one division. Then on the 12th of February, so nearly a month later, like I said, the 19th Division was slightly ahead of themselves, and it's narrower further north, so it was easier for them to cross. But then the 12th of February, 20th Indian Division cross. So Kimura, the Japanese Burma Area Army commander, is like, they've landed two divisions either side of Mandalay, one to the north, one to the south or southwest. That must be what they're going for. They're obviously going for Mandalay. And then Slim throws him a little carrot. He then throws the 7th Indian Division, and I'm going to talk more about their crossing in a minute, but he throws them across the Irrawaddy as well on the 14th, Valentine's Day, or the night of the 14th to the 15th. And the hope here is that Kimura blinks. He will start to send soldiers south towards the new crossing further south on the 14th of February. That then will make Kimura unsure which of the two sides is it. Is it Mandalay to the north, or is it Meiktila? And then his big one, he does a crossing on the 24th of February with the 2nd British Division. 3 divisions are now attacking Mandalay, one from the north and these 2 from the south. What's happened down on the 14th of February looks like a diversion. One division crossing nowhere near anywhere famous, whereas there's 3 divisions at the most famous town in sort of British culture within Burma being attacked to the north. Of course they're going. This deception as well, is one of the sort of the crucial aspects of this. It's why the Japanese trap 2 of their 3 armies, 6 divisions north of Meiktila. This is what Slim wants, because when the Japanese inevitably counterattack Meiktila after the Thunder Run, they will be trapped on the plain between these 2 areas, and that is where Slim will destroy them. And that's the overall plan here. So let's talk about the crossing, though. So the 14th of February, this guy called Lieutenant John Henslow. Now, again, he's an amazing character. I did talk about him in Forgotten Armour as well, but I go into a bit more of what he did on the crossing of the Irrawaddy. Now, he's one of the guys that's commanding the boats crossing, and these are some of his these are some of these are his personal photos. Other ones are ones that are more formal ones. And the bottom right one in particular is the best one to look at. So if you're looking at the bottom right photo, this is B4 Beach, and this is the 1st and 10th Gurkhas off the top of my head being released ashore once they've crossed later in the afternoon. Now, the thing that happens here is the crossing starts badly, but eventually goes fine. So here's the actual maps of the crossing. And again, sorry, it's slightly messed around with my thing. So the crossing today. What I liked about the aerial photograph here is you can see just how much the sands shift in the Irrawaddy. And this is why another one of the reasons why it's such a difficult proposition to cross. The Irrawaddy is very fast flowing. The sands shift every single monsoon season, and obviously, the weight of water that comes down and then deposits everything once all of that water has carried on through. Flowing out into the Bay of Bengal before the dry season dries it up a bit. The Irrawaddy at its worst can be 6 miles wide. But this is not monsoon, this is the dry season, so it isn't as wide as that. It's more like 1 to 2 miles that we're talking about here. And it depends who you are. If you're the silent crossing, and this is the first part of the plan, they wanted to cross the Irrawaddy silently. And so the 2nd South Lancashires, who got the gig basically because they were the ones that invaded Madagascar, so they know how to do amphibious assaults, despite the fact that, a river crossing and a naval amphibious assault are actually quite different things. But also, this is not a, they don't have, like the Rhine, bear in mind as well, this is 3 times the width of the Rhine. They do not have the culmination of amphibious warfare techniques.
It's funny you mentioned, because I was about to mention that, having just learned from what I learned from John Kuratola earlier this week about just how much effort the Allies have put in the ETO, bringing up landing craft, LCVPs, all the stuff there, all the tech, dry runs of assembling bridges, planning it all out. The effort being done here in a very different theatre with very different problems is equally astounding, but it's interesting to compare the two of just what's going on. And the current terminology John Kuratola reminds us is they call it wet gap operations now. So anything that's either an amphibious operation via a river that's the military terminology they use. I'm not making it up, folks. It's a wet gap crossing. If it's wet and it's a gap, that's what the military call it. So whether it's a river, a creek, a canal, a sea, wet gap.
Oh, it just feels like a bit of innuendo bingo, doesn't it?
It does feel a bit weird, doesn't it?
But yeah, so I mean, on that, John Henslow talks about exactly this. They're using flimsy assault boats. Think the bit in A Bridge Too Far when they're crossing the Vaal, things like that. They're making their own barges. On the Henslow picture there, you can see they're making their own barges to cross things, including Bailey Bridge sections on pontoons. To do this crossing, Henslow has to, they have to clean all the, he sees Remy opening up all the outboard motor engines to clean all the sand out, because just again, thinking about Western Europe, I mean, I remember looking this up when I was writing it. Antwerp is 100 miles from the Rhine, so I'm trying to remember, is Antwerp even open actually in March 1945? It is, isn't it? Antwerp. Yeah. March 1945, Antwerp is open, and it's about 100 miles on Western European road links to the Rhine. 100 miles Western European roads. The Irrawaddy is something like 400 miles from Dimapur, and it's closer to, like 800 miles from Calcutta, which I suppose is probably even more like the actual equivalent to Antwerp. And what they have to do as well, remember, is just from Dimapur, so again, not even talking about the hundreds of miles between Calcutta and Dimapur, you've got 4,000 feet mountains to Kohima that drop 4,000 feet down to Imphal, and then another sort of 3,500 feet in the Chin Hills, then back down another 4,000 feet into the valleys that come to the Irrawaddy, the Gangaur Valley, and so on. And because it's dry season, all of it is dusty. They talk about how they're ankle deep in dust, like it's desert as well. And the engines have suffered for that reason. But basically, the 2nd South Lancashires are actually going to go across silently. They're actually paddling across. And John Henslow's in the second wave with a Punjabi regiment. And when the South Lancashires go across, they're paddling 2 miles. It takes them a couple of hours setting out, or it might be like an hour and a half, I think it was actually. But they spend an hour and a half paddling across, and they inevitably arrive late. So sunrise comes up. The first C company, make it ashore silently, up one of those re-entrants, because there are 4 of these re-entrants that they're climbing up. And the Japanese have positions up on these cliff tops, and actually the Indian National Army, who then get stiffeners later in the morning of the Japanese. So it is an INA unit that initially opposes it. And so when Henslow is crossing, as he reaches the other side, and he's on a powered boat, although they're very bad quality, they end up having to lash 3 boats together with one outboard between them, a working outboard. And he sees that there's machine gun fire in the water. He sees boats drifting away with bodies. And eventually, as he's coming in, he starts shouting to some of the other boats. And they've all basically just followed the guy in front. And there was confusion launching the waves. And basically, they ended up with reserve waves at the front and the second and third waves further back. And the reserves have been told, follow the others in. So when the reserves reached the beach, they then just spun around, waiting for the next boat to go in front of them. And they all do the same. And Henslow comes into this, and the South Lanks are taking casualties, and eventually they pull back across. But the waves keep going. Henslow drops his guys off, and it becomes a bit of a ferry service. But they do eventually, C Company, the 2nd South Lanks, hold onto their bridgehead. They then slowly expand it as other regiments then cross. But it's a really close run thing, that bit first thing in the morning. And the big thing that happens is, because the initial phase failed, Evans, the 7th Division commander, Geoffrey Evans, he had brought up, they'd been concealed, but when the silent attack failed, he had his tanks and artillery ready to go. So the moment they realized it wasn't working, they then came up. They also had cab ranks of aircraft available as well, and they then start to plaster the far bank, and it's this firepower. Henslow talks about how naked or similar he felt when they first went over, and now with the planes going overhead, the artillery and so on, he said it felt completely different when he went with the follow-up waves.
Got a couple of questions from Trevor about crossing. One is, how did they hide the Allied formation from the Japanese Air Force? So, I mean, moving up bridging equipment is something you can't really, conceal very easily. And the follow-up one is, did they consider doing this wet gap crossing at night? So how do they keep it all secret from the Japanese air power and nighttime consideration? 2 questions.
So really, the Japanese had lost any semblance of even competing for the sky in February of 1944. The Battle of the Admin Box was completely predicated on the fact that there was already air supremacy, not even superiority, supremacy. The Japanese make occasional hit and run attacks. A year later, it's even worse. I mean, it was already really bad by February 1944 for the Japanese. It was when Spitfire Mark V's arrived for the British and Indian Air Force, for the Royal Air Force and the Indian Air Force. And then the introduction of things like P-38 Lightnings in the USAF and P-51s as well. And they also, in particular, they do... So whilst the British often did close protection because the Spitfire has a shorter range, the P-51s and the Lightnings, they actually go as far south as, the Central Plain from the Imphal area and the Brahmaputra Valley. They're going as far south as places like Meiktila, destroying the Japanese aircraft on the ground, at the beginning of 1944. The second one is they did consider a night crossing. They decided that with the size of the river, that bringing in follow-up waves in the dark, they were just too concerned. What their compromise was, we want the first wave to cross silently and arrive at dawn, and then the follow-up waves will be there after the initial bridgehead has been captured. And Evans admits afterwards that he made a mistake. He should have just gone loud straight away, not even bothered. They had the firepower. His biggest concern really was he was worried about building up enough artillery ammunition in particular. Right. And so his compromise means that, the trouble is there were then delays that meant he probably could have done, but the operation was already in motion. He he admitted he was wrong, but the trouble is, at the end of the day, he still pushes it through, and the casualties aren't horrific. Second South Lancs take, dozens of casualties, but they're not like a decimated force. They drift away, like when a boat got hit, they drifted away and things like that. So it's not the slaughter, the cliches of Omaha Beach, for example. It's not like that.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah. So then you get the Thunder Run. So again, this still, Alt 92. Yeah, Pagan to the bottom left is where all the golden pagodas are. All of the people, like everyone who crosses the Irrawaddy, both in the combat but also over the following weeks and months, they all comment on the pagodas and how beautiful it was. And I should say the reason why I've put that there, by the way, is the 1st and 11th Sikhs had crossed as well at the same time, partly as a diversion from the main crossing. Even though they only got a couple of platoons across, they actually they managed to get an entire battalion of INA to surrender to them, and then the INA crossed on their own boats and took themselves off to captivity, or at least they took themselves over to the other side. So anyway, then we get to the Thunder Run itself, and then this is really, so far most of what we've said is really a bit of intro. So sorry, I've used half an hour so far just doing intro.
It's brilliant intro though. We love it.
Trevor, it's like you've read the book, Trevor. We will come to an air observation post.
Is he being teacher's pet right now? He is, isn't he? Yeah.
Trevor is, he knows his stuff clearly. So the Thunder Run itself, so 21st of February. Now, if you've got good memories, you'll know this is before the 2nd British Division have crossed the Irrawaddy further north. And again, there is still a point to this. Slim is desperate for Kimura to think that this is all a feint. All this stuff down near Meiktila, Nyonggu, and so on, they are desperate. He's desperate for them to think that this is a feint. And again, what he wants it to look like is that this is this Thunder Run. And remember, Thunder Run is a modern word. No one at the time is saying that. I'm using that word that I would like to stick, but I'm labeling it that rather than they called it that. Now the thing is that this looks like madness, because and this is sort of the big point that I want to get here is, unlike say Operation Market Garden, and again, I'm not trying to tread on any sort of European toes or anything and upset anyone, but one of the things that I do have a slight tin hat on, but a slight feeling was one of the mistakes with 30 Corps' drive to Meiktila that I think this approach would have this approach would have helped in Europe, especially with air supremacy and the logistics that were available in the European theatre. The Thunder Run has absolutely no intention of protecting any of the supply line behind it. Meiktila is 80 miles from Nyonggu. So all of these white arrows that are the route that the Thunder Run takes, all of these roads that they're following, they will be closed behind them. There is no protecting the supply line. The entirety of the two main units that are going, 17th Indian Division, the Black Cats, and the 255th Indian Tank Brigade. And it should be said, people like George MacDonald Fraser, probably the most famous Burma memoir out there. He's on this Thunder Run. He's there with the 9th Borders as part of 17th Indian Division. We're talking 3,000 vehicles, 2 brigades of 17th Indian Division, we should say, because actually the 99th Brigade of the 17th Division are going to be flown in later. Once they've captured some airfields, they will come in as reinforcements. But all of this will be supplied by air. All of the petrol, ammunition, food, all of these things, they will do it by air. Now, my feeling, and again, tin hat on, is that perhaps this could have been attempted at Market Garden. I mean, maybe it would be too bold, and so on. I'm not saying I think that would have worked, but I would just be fascinated from a counter historical point of view. Is if someone ever war gamed that kind of thing, maybe I should speak to some of the war gamers, see if they can come up with something for that. I'd love to see if you could air supply 30 Corps going to Arnhem, and then you don't have to worry about Hell's Highway behind you. But that's effectively what this is. This is them punching through. And again, some of the guys that write and survive this, and I'm very lucky as well. There's a man in Portugal, Frank McClintock, who emailed me completely out of the blue through my publisher, and he said, my father was on the Thunder Run and was at Meiktila, and I filmed him about a year before he died, a couple of hours worth of interviews talking all about it.
Wow.
You know, and he said,
gold mine. Yeah.
Absolutely. And a real gentleman as well. And him, like so others, they had the time of their life doing this. They were bouncing over this desert. You know, it was like it was like a cavalry charge. You hear all sorts of cavalry things. So this quote I've got here, this is from Miles Smeaton, who's the lead. He's the CO of 5th Probins Horse. And again, I used him a bit in my previous book, and he's going to occur in this one again. Because again, he's just such a wonderful eyewitness to these events. So his quote was, "It was a thrill not incomparable perhaps to the excitement of a cavalry charge of the old days, yet it was a cavalry charge of today." You know, and we were never unable to move like this. We're unfettered by responsibility to the infantry. They're just hammering through the desert, for this time. And it takes them about a week to get to Meiktila itself. But they have one stop on the way, major stop, and that's the village of Oyin. And you'll see on the top right that I've included a Sherman here that's got this sort of wire fencing on top of it that they've built. Now, this is designed really to try and make it difficult for any Japanese to climb on top of the tank. The thing that you notice about 1945 in terms of the Japanese against tanks in particular, and at Oyin especially, is the ferocity of Japanese suicide tactics against tanks in particular. So the Oyin is the one where I think it really shocks a lot of the soldiers in the tank units in particular, where you have Japanese soldiers that literally, carrying their bomb like a rugby ball, barging through some surprised Indian soldiers, jumping under a tank and blowing themselves up. Another guy one describes where he tries to put it in between the tracks as it's moving, and his arm gets caught before the whole thing blows him up, and all this stuff. And people climbing on tanks and having to be shot off the tanks. It's really an incredible battle, really. And what they do is from this road that you can see running north to south. And again, I've given you a picture of the the modern day sort of Google Maps version of it. They go in through sort of the central. They come down the main road, and then they cut in those two angles, and they come at it from multiple different sides. And the Japanese have built their main position in the sort of the lake, the little pond thing. They're called Jeels, Jeels, and they are like a community pond, because in this central dry belt, they need this water to survive through the dry season. So they have these community ponds that they fill over the wet season, the monsoon season. And then that kind of gives them a bare minimum for certain things. They obviously, it's not good for drinking water and so on, but they have to be, they have to have this water for other purposes, their crops and so on. So they go through Oyin, they do clear it. It's the biggest the battle on the Thunder Run itself. There are multiple small actions. This is the only big one that takes most of a day. This is a good one as well, where things like infantry and tank cooperation is built before the main battle takes place a couple of weeks later. The tanks and most of the infantry have been in battle a lot. The 17th Indian Division, for those that know their Burma campaign, they're the ones who they're there from the very beginning. They fight the Japanese when they first invade Burma. At the Sitang Bridge disaster that's blown up, half of them are on the wrong side. They have to be rebuilt. They then fight at Imphal very, 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 very hard. And then they're the spearhead of the Thunder Run in 1945. So they really go through the whole campaign. They're experienced men. The tank regiments, however, 5th Province Horse, 9th Deccan Horse, 255th Indian Tank Brigade, they are Indian units that have been mechanised in the war. This is their first action. They might have the odd guy and some British who have served in other places, but generally speaking, most of the tank crews are green and they're fresh. And so there is a bit of learning takes place at Oyin, and they learn it very, very quickly of how you attack the Japanese and Japanese occupied Burmese villages with wooden bashers, they called them, tamarind trees, dappling the earth and things like that, because they have lots of trees because they're shady amongst the they need the shade in the dry season. They need all that shade. And then we get to the Battle of Meiktila itself. So this is Cowan's battle of all. They surround it from 3 sides and they reduce it over a series of days. Now, I had one of the most amazing pieces of luck doing my research. When we actually captured the Japanese after, the guy that was in charge of this initial Japanese garrison, a guy called Kasuya, Major General Kasuya, and he's just some transport guy. He's a logistician. That's why he's in Meiktila. He's just a transport guy. And he's put in charge of the defense. Now, actually, considering the circumstances, he does really the best he can possibly ever do, but it's not enough. And amazingly, he actually was ordered out at the last minute, just as their pockets being reduced. He's told to get out. And so he's captured at the end of the war, and he is interrogated, and his interrogation is available in the National Archives. So I was able to get down. He drew a map of everywhere he put his troops, what he felt at the end of each day. He did it day by day, what happened. So, an amazing resource to get the leader of this garrison's opinion of everything that's happening day by day. So when in the chapter of the book about the Battle of Meiktila, because I've got so much for every day, it's a whole chapter for 4 days, or the 28th to the 3rd of March, and I break it down by day. I subdivide the whole chapter by day because there's just so much to talk about. And I'm not going to have time to talk about all of it, but there are some really amazing things. This is a zoomed in version of it as well, and you can see the way that the railway comes in through the middle. It crosses like a sort of marshy causeway between the 2 lakes, and there's a smaller village called Kanna on the left-hand side, and Kanna really is the centre of the fighting. And the thing that we have to remember about Meiktila is that this is a modern town. It's a large town. This is the so Neil, it won't be it isn't the Gordon Highlanders in that picture. The Gordon Highlanders are still at Nyonggu at this point. They don't go to Oyen until after the battle, after the whole Thunder Run is over. The 116th, they're definitely still at Nyonggu at this point. They're not on the Thunder Run. That photo, I think, is the Deccan Horse that go through there. But no, my point with these photos really is that Meiktila is not a wooden huts, bashers, trees. This is a settlement that has turned into a town that has then become, it has European style buildings. This was the center of a number of different businesses in the middle of the war, transport in particular. And so there was a European expatriate community. There was also an Indian community that had evacuated in the war. Some of them had stayed. I've got a brilliant letter from a lady, Miss Kaisanessa Ahmed, and her husband disappears, and she writes this letter to Cowan whilst she's in Meiktila, basically saying, someone's arrested my husband, he and my 2 sons. Whatever they did for the Japanese, that they were forced to do it. He's a good servant. Turns out the guy hadn't just told his wife what he was up to. He was going around with the British, basically guiding them, and he just hadn't told his wife. And she thought they'd arrested him when actually he'd gone off with them and was helping them. So yeah, amazing thing. But so the overall point I'm saying here, with it being a modern city town, is that this is a street battle. Okay, there are bits on the periphery that are more like what you'd expect in Burma, but this is a street by street, tooth and claw fight. Now, because I said earlier, Meiktila is a supply hub as well. The supply hub at Meiktila, therefore, is full of extra weapons and ammunition. One of the most famous things about Meiktila is the pits in the ground that were dug, and Japanese soldiers were sat in them with an aerial bomb, a planes bomb, and a rock or a hammer to strike the detonator and blow it up. One of the most famous things, and there is a slightly grim but very famous photo of a Japanese soldier who has been shot in one. And there's one guy, I can't remember the eyewitness for it as well now, but basically they came across one of these Japanese soldiers, and because they were told wait to blow up a tank, the guy just sits there and stares at the British soldiers for a second, does nothing, doesn't hit the bomb. The guys sort of freeze. They realize he's not going to hit the bomb, and so they shoot the guy. Obviously they shoot the guy. This is a war. That guy is waiting for a tank, clearly. And so the guy does nothing. Like, he ends up doing nothing. He's a wasted life. You know, this shows you the sort of the attitude of Japanese soldiery, what their training has conditioned them for. The Bushido, kamikaze, obviously is a similar sort of thing. And so instead of taking 2 or 3 guys with him, because he was told to wait for a tank, he did nothing instead of taking a couple of guys with him. You know, really interesting mindset. You know, he's been discovered. What does he think is going to happen? The Brits are going to be like, or the Indians are going to be like, okay, fine, you wait for a tank, we'll leave you there. No, of course they're going to do. Like, it's a really strange mindset to me, that part of it, because obviously I get why his Bushido means he's going to commit suicide, but you know, the game's up. You may as well do something. You know,
Yeah.
I'm glad for the guys he didn't, and for the British and Indians and so on. But you know, I find it very strange. But yeah, anyway, so the fighting is grim and street fighting, and that brings me to these two. So unusually in this 4-day battle, you know, when we think about, you know, D-Day, such an amazing event, 100,000 odd soldiers that first day and so on, that in this battle of a few thousand men, you know, you're talking at fewer than 10,000. This is less than a division, because the 17th Indian Division, remember, one of its brigades has been left behind, and the 255th Indian Tank Brigade only has one battalion of infantry organically attached to it. So we're talking at fewer than 10,000 men. We're probably closer to more like 8,000 men on the Thunder Run. So 2 Victoria Crosses in a couple of days is really, really interesting. Just Jim Walsh looks like John Travolta. I mean, that would be a brave casting decision, I think, to do that. But these 2 stories are just incredible. So apologies if people have heard them before, but in case people haven't heard them, I'm going to recount them now.
No, please go ahead.
So Naik Fazal Din is a Victoria Cross in the 7th and 10th Baluch Regiment. And again, if anyone's heard of John Randall, who's written a couple of books, memoirs of his time, he was one of the commanders of one of the companies at the time, but Fazal Din is not in his. A Naik is like a lance corporal or corporal in the Indian Army, by the way. And so what they're doing is they're going bunker to bunker at that village of Kanna on the western side of Meiktila, west of the lakes. They're going bunker to bunker. They're clearing their way through outside. They're just south of a hospital. And the Japanese, interestingly, had basically got all of the patients in the hospitals to man the windows with rifles. And a Gurkha regiment has to go quite grimly through the hospital, you know, room to room. You know, you imagine the corridors of a hospital and fighting through a hospital, like a horror film almost. And these wounded Japanese soldiers fighting from their beds effectively and out the windows of their beds. But this is just to the south of that later that day. And a different regiment. And for Fazal Din, basically, they're going bunker to bunker. And obviously, one particular Japanese bunker decides where we may, instead of dying inside the bunker, we're going to charge. So they charge out of their bunker, like, you know, your typical Banzai charge that you see in the Pacific or something like that, you know, or I was going to say sampan, but that's a type of boat. What's the island with the famous Banzai charge at the end of the battle? Saipan. Sorry. You know, that kind of thing, but it's maybe 4 or 5 guys, and they charge out. One of them's an officer with a samurai sword. So they charge Fazal Din and his section, you know, 6, 8 guys, whatever it is, and it's very close range. The Bren gunner takes out a couple of them as they close up with them, but then runs out of ammunition. So he's fumbling with a reload as a Japanese guy gets to him. The officer gets to him. The guy's killed with a samurai sword. Fazal Din goes to rescue and tries to intervene hand to hand. And the Japanese soldier stabs Fazal Din. You know, the phrase in the citation is ran him through, which, you know, ran him through traditionally means it's gone all the way through. Yeah. In the citation, it mentions as well that the tip of the sword came out of Fazal Din's back, so it passes all the way through his body. Fazal Din manages, and again, this is where detail a little bit hazy, but pushes the Japanese guy off, whatever. He removes the sword, or the Japanese guy falls away and the sword comes out. Fazal Din picks up the sword, kills the Japanese guy on the ground, and then rescues another one of his section mates.
That's really badass, isn't it? That's you know, that's serious. You know, you've been stabbed all the way through, and you use the same sword. I mean, that's.
I mean, yeah. I mean, it is badass.
Make it up, can you?
You can't. And like, I mean, and this is not, I'm not saying I discovered this story. This is a very famous story, but it's just, putting it back out there kind of thing. He then makes sure his section are okay and ready to move on. And he then goes back to the command post where he reports in, and then goes to be treated by the regimental aid post, where he dies a few hours later. He does die of his wounds. Now, and yeah, absolutely, it's the adrenaline and things like that that must be getting him through. That's the only answer to that question. And the incredible thing is that he is seen by the platoon commander and basically the platoon HQ. This happens barely 40, 50 meters in front of his own platoon commanders and things like that. This is a very well witnessed event. Put it that way is what I'm trying to say. And then the next, so that's on the 2nd of March. On the 3rd of March, William Weston of the 1st West Yorks, First West Yorks, he has come. He's in the centre of Meiktila, and it's right at the end of the battle. The last Japanese troops are being sort of mopped up, and they've reached the banks of the lake. So if I go back if I skipped it, there it is. So on the South Lake, can you see there's sort of like almost in the middle of the town itself, there are two sort of peninsulas on the south side. So it's west of Canna, west of the causeway, and so on. But like right on the banks, and there's the two fingers pressing out into the water of the southern lake. And what happens is, as the West Yorks get here, one of the groups of Japanese basically jump into the river and try to swim to the south side of the lake. And the tanks and the infantry basically line up and have as an American would say, a turkey shoot as they're trying to swim away across the water. They think as many as a company of Japanese are killed that way. And as they're kind of, they're sort of now relaxing a little bit, there's a burst of machine gun fire from a couple of Japanese who have stayed inside their bunker. And Weston charges the bunker. A couple of a tank also fires a couple of rounds towards it, but Weston and his West Yorks are close to it. And as he charges the bunker, the Japanese gunners inside, he takes a couple of bullets as he closes on it, and he literally throws his body across the aperture of the machine gun, so the machine gun can't fire. Now, Weston, and again, the Victoria Cross mentions this, he's not that far away from his own guys. It's dozens of yards. He could have tried to get to cover. Instead, he pulls a grenade off of his webbing, he pulls the pin, and he rolls himself into the bunker and blows himself up and the guys inside. And the West Yorks then come up behind. They, instead of throwing in normal grenades, they throw in a couple of phosphorus grenades, and then they basically grab him by the legs and pull him back out. And then they finish off the bunker. And he's died straight. He's died at the scene. He's 21 years old as well. Fazaldin's a little bit older, but Weston's 21 years old, and what he did. And yeah, Kevin, absolutely. The sacrifice he had for his men. Because that's exactly what he's thinking. His guys were being shot at from behind. They think that the battle is over. Like I said, they're relaxing. And he does that at 21 years of age. Again, I think, I'm a teacher. For those that don't know my day job, I think of like the 18-year-old year 13s, and a couple of years later, third years at university, that sort of thing, doing this kind of thing. It's incredible. But yeah, anyway, after the sort of the mopping up takes place, and then there's this guy, he's another guy that I'm following in the book, Captain Donald Maitland. And he was an intelligence officer in the 17th Indian Division. He goes on after the war to have a really, really big diplomatic career. He's the, this is a picture of him when he's the ambassador to the United Nations and so on. But he's a young intelligence officer in 17th Indian Division during this battle. He's on the Thunder Run and so on. And he's basically going around to all the local families, and that's why I've included the photo on the left. He's speaking to the local Burmese, the people that fled the town as the British were arriving to get away from the battle. Although, some of them are killed in the crossfire. They're in bunkers underneath buildings and so on. That's something I didn't mention earlier. The Japanese built, they used the cellars and all these sorts of things and all the buildings in Meiktila to hide, but also in the local area villages. And basically, Maitland's thing is, we'll give you a cup of tea, a bit of food, things like that. Come and see me. Tell us what you've seen over the last couple of weeks. Tell us what's going on. And the thing that happens is because it's all tanks and artillery, priest self-propelled guns that have arrived at Meiktila, the Burmese can see the writing on the wall. They're deciding, that's not Maitland in the photo, by the way, so that's just an ordinary soldier. It's the fact that he's with a local family and Maitland is interviewing local people to find out what's going on. And the reason why I'm bringing this up really is because, I'm not going to dwell too much on Maitland. His story, is very much on the intelligence side. But the point that I'm bringing up is this is how the next phase of the battle is going to take place. Cowan is not going to make a continuous defense of Meiktila. He doesn't have the troops for that. He's never going to be able to actually achieve that. So Maitland is important because what he wants to hear, he has interpreters that have come with them as well. He himself didn't speak Burmese, but he is a linguist, so he probably picked up a significant amount. He basically spends a year after the war learning Arabic, for example, and this is kind of he gets into diplomacy through the Middle East first before he then becomes United Nations and so on. Now Maitland is collecting all of this information, and that's what then Cowan uses to decide where he's going to send attacks, because his defense is not going to be passive. He's going to send sweeps of armored units, tanks, infantry, self-propelled guns, going all around. Bullet Tooth Tony, it's 8,000 at the beginning of the battle of the Thunder Run. Now, the 30,000 Japanese are not all in one place. The initial battle for Meiktila, it's actually about 8,000 against 2,000, but the 2,000 are obviously holed up in the bunkers and basements of a city. It's not brilliant odds. It's what you want. You want 3-1, don't you? But it is a city fight, and also Cowan has to split his forces in 3 because he has to surround the city and attack it from multiple sides. The lakes divide it up, so again, it's about splitting forces. But the Japanese reinforcements that will come back, you are talking sort of 30,000 soldiers maximum. And they never all arrive at once when we come to it. But I mean, one of the things that's important actually in this whole thing, the reconquest of Burma, we often think of the Japanese broken at Imphal and Kohima, but actually the Japanese do still actually outnumber what Slim puts across the Irrawaddy. And I saw people have mentioned about logistics and so on earlier, how important they are. Slim can't have more than 5 divisions east of the Irrawaddy. The logistical system just won't hack it. Aerial resupply and the road resupply, they will not be able to have more than that. It's why, for example, British divisions are withdrawn, because British divisions with their, they have a greater need of supplies. So it's only Indian divisions that are east of the Irrawaddy, apart from the 2nd British Division right at the beginning. The rest of the campaign is only Indian divisions because they're just easier to supply. And Robert as well, I will get to the 5th Indian Division, don't worry. So Donald Maitland is collecting all of this information so that during the siege, Cowan can send his troops to all of these different things. And so the blue circles on this particular map, these are the official history maps. The blue circles are basically the concentrations of Japanese troops who arrive. Now, the 2 main units are the 18th Japanese Division that come down from the north. Now, Kimura, the Burma Area Army Commander above Honda, he says after the war, before he's executed for war crimes, Kimura says that the 18th Division is his best unit, his best fighting division. And they've recently been fighting the Americans and the Chinese and the 36th British Division up in the Hukong Valley, up in the far north, the Northern Combat Area Command. And 18th Division are brought south as his best troops because Meiktila is so important, and the 49th Division come from the south. But there are other things as well. Those are 2 whole divisions, although the 18th Division is under strength. But there are also units brought across from 28th and 33rd Army, as well as 15th Japanese armies, these are. So the attack on Meiktila is not a particularly well coordinated one. And I've put Honda here, but actually Honda only takes command halfway through the siege. Before that, it's Katamura of 15th Army, who is also fighting the battle at Mandalay. And so Katamura has too much on. So the first 2 weeks of the siege of Meiktila, Cowan has time to run his defense up because the Japanese arrive piecemeal. Cowan can work out exactly how he's going to fight this aggressive defense, sending these armored sweeps to all those different blue circles on the map at various different times, depending where the Japanese are. And this is Maitland's job. Where are the Japanese? And then Cowan responds to Maitland's intelligence, and also armored car patrols, and also aerial reconnaissance. And yes, the first air commandos are the ones that are dropping supplies to all of this throughout this, and other units. It's another polyglot force. Slim is able to persuade Mountbatten to take basically all the air assets he needs. There's some chicanery that goes on, but I won't go into the politics of that now. But yes, Slim gets all of the air supply he needs, including the first air commandos. So Cowan ends up, once basically Kimura realizes the ridiculousness of having Katamura fighting both these two battles, Honda is given command from 33rd Army, which is basically coming down from the north, who again have been fighting the NCAC to the north. And yes, Midi Doctors, the Slim's destruction, his strategy is definitely to destroy the Japanese in and around this area. Again, he's after an army battle to destroy the Japanese army. He doesn't really care about territory. He's all about destroying the Japanese. I probably should have made that a little bit earlier as well. So what he does, he sends out all these things, but because Honda only arrives halfway through, the strategy of the Japanese is not that good. And it's halfway through, really, that Honda then realized what he should be doing. And so I meant to bring this up earlier. This is the kind of thing this is the kind of thing that typifies what we're talking about. So they're sent out to wherever the Japanese are identified. The infantry are riding on the back of the tanks. As they close in with the reported Japanese position, the infantry get off and the tanks and infantry then go in together. And the top right, they're going from hut to hut because it's mostly in villages around the periphery of Meiktila. Again, but you can see the nature of the ground. It's hard, dry, baked, or it's sand, slightly depending where you are. And even, one of the ways that I've thought about this, there's a brilliant scene in The Thin Red Line where there's sort of like a relatively long shot of they're going between bashes and so on. That I could kind of almost like do it. I can almost sort of picture it. It would be similar to that, I suppose. And again, George MacDonald Fraser, he talks about battles like this. He talks about a place called Yindor. Yindor was quite a grim village that they had to fight through over a couple of days. That sort of thing. Anyway, so this brings me now to a couple more of our characters. So I think it was Trevor brought up earlier, the air observation. Lieutenant Jack Scollon from 656 Air Observation Squadron. He's a fascinating character. He has an unpublished memoir in the Imperial War Museum that I've mined quite a bit. Because he has a wonder, he sees the battle from the sky. He sees things like, when the tanks are hunting for the Japanese guns. The Japanese bring a load of extra artillery pieces. They bring 250mm guns, a couple of 105. Basically, Kimura gives Katamura and then Honda all of his heavy artillery for this battle. Basically all of it. So it's no longer divisional artillery in these attacks. These are army assets, just to clear the Thunder Run and Meiktila. That's how big a deal this is. And Scollon witnesses this hunt going on, and he's searching for them. He talks about things like times when he feels the artillery, shaking his little plane. He's in Taylorcraft Oysters, which are, like a bit like what they say, like L5 Stinsons or the Grasshoppers. They're kind of small, light aircraft, only about 130 mile an hour. He also talks about the time that the Hurricanes and Spitfires have great fun buzzing him. So they'll fly over him as close as they can get at 400 miles an hour just to scare him. It gets on his nerves. But he sees it from up there. He sees some of the fighting over the airfield as well. Cowan obviously is the key guy here, but also Lieutenant Colonel Hugh Pettigrew, who's the chief of staff. He writes a memoir that is unpublished, although it had a limited run publish called "It Seemed So Ordinary," and that's it. But he writes really movingly on the relationship between Cowan, because one of the things that's often forgotten is in the middle of this battle, Cowan loses his son, who is an officer in the I'm going to get one of the Gurkha regiments fighting at Mandalay. His only son is killed fighting the Japanese 80 miles north of him. And he's in the middle of this battle where he's surrounded 80 miles behind Japanese lines, cut off and so on. And in the middle of this battle, and no one really knew it at the time, but he actually goes off. He's clearly quite badly. Yes, that's Pettigrew's child in his lap. I don't know which one of his children, because he has a couple of different children. Pettigrew writes letters home during the battle, really movingly, missing his wife, because him and Cowan argue quite a lot. So it's really, really good. Pettigrew is a really, really good way of seeing the man that Cowan was, because Cowan never wrote a memoir or anything like that. He never wrote anything. So Pettigrew, who lived cheek by jowl with him, and they actually conflicted quite a few times as well. Pettigrew, Pettigrew saw part of his job as being the sort of the voice of reason, and many people felt that actually he was going slightly too far, criticizing things. That something was dangerous. He was the kind of, in the relationship, he's the guy that's always going, "Are you sure, sir? Is that wise, sir?" And Cowan getting annoyed. Of course it's wise. And Cowan doesn't suffer fools. Pettigrew has a very fine line, and he feels after the war he didn't get it right. And I think his devotion to Cowan as a man shines through as well, especially what Cowan went through. Robert Lyman and Pettigrew actually, I think, intimates this, but Robert Lyman certainly thinks that Cowan probably was in the early stages of if not grief and depression, but maybe even post-traumatic stress by the end of this battle. So it's amazing, how he carries on. Anyway, so when Honda takes over this battle, what he does is he targets the airfield to the east. Now, this was one of the first objectives that Cowan had on the Thunder Run. Capture the airfield, and then that will be how we get resupply, because they can survive a few days at a time on parachute drops, but really they want bulk delivery from aircraft landing. Okay, and a couple of people have mentioned, so during the Thunder Run as well, the 99th Brigade of 17th Indian Division flew in to support the attack. And now they've landed at the airfield, and in particular, as the Japanese pressure is beginning to tell, Slim gives him his part of his reserve. So the 5th Indian Division, they were the division that had actually pushed south out of Imphal. They led the counterattack south of Imphal through the Tidim Road and over the Chin Hills, parallel to the 11th East African Division. And what they'd done is they had been put into reserve, rested, and then they used the when the pressure at Meiktila is beginning to build, Slim says, take the 99th Brigade Sorry, I've got some numbers wrong around here. 99th Brigade is 17th Indian Division. 9th Brigade of the 5th Indian Division, they are flown in as well to support, and in particular to defend the airfield alongside the RAF regiment. And we should say is that this battle is often seen by the RAF regiment. This is their coming of age. Obviously, they're invented after Crete. They have some other smaller scale things, but this is the one where where the RAF regiment in particular feels this is the thing that makes them indispensable to the RAF because of the effort they go to. And I'm going to talk a bit more about that in a minute. But they fly in the extra brigade, so there's now 4 brigades of infantry, and there's a brigade of the 255th Indian Tank Brigade. And then they have to fight off. They're still doing the sweeps around the periphery, but the battle is definitely concentrated on the airfield, really from about the 14th of March for the rest of the battle. So all the other sweeps are still going on. Don't get me wrong, there are other things going on as well, but the focus of the battle is this. And Honda has done this because he has been seeing for the previous 2 weeks all of these planes landing, coming down on this airstrip. And his thing is, well, these guys are 80 miles behind enemy lines. Take the airfield, or at least neutralize the airfield. Use our artillery to batter the airfield, and so on. Then they will wither on the vine. The Thunder Run will die in place. Now they need to be proactive. The Japanese can't wait for that to happen because the rest of 4 Corps might arrive. Really, by this point, Kimura is trying to survive until the monsoon and hope that October 1945 will be very different. No one knows about anything going on with the atomic bomb, obviously. So planning is taking place into 1946. Kimura is hoping to hold on. And he's definitely not going to be able to do that if Meiktila stays and 4 Corps and 14th Army catch up to it. So the focus now becomes on this landing ground. And I've given a quote here, again, Charlie Braitley, he wrote letters that are now in the Imperial War Museum. So I've got his letters that he wrote live, and this quote really hit me, because this is the 29th. He says this on the 29th of March. It's the end of the battle, and he's writing in a as censor friendly a way, and it's annoying. He refers to a letter to his mother, but doesn't actually. The letter to the mother doesn't survive. I don't know what's happened to that. So to put it mildly, it's pretty bloody. I've tried to keep cheerful in my letter to mother, but I'm afraid I wrote a rather shaky one about a week ago. I hope it didn't upset her at all. That typifies what happens at the airfield, really. So let's get into that a little bit more. Here's an aerial photograph of it that you'll see. And D-box is basically where the garrison that defends the airfield is based. And the reason why there's D-box is they do not have enough men to surround the entire airfield. So every morning, the Japanese infiltrate in the night, and the men from D-box, the RAF regiment, have to leave the box and recapture the airfield every single morning for 2 weeks. And it's it's big open territory. There are the casualties are very heavy. As Brady put it, it's pretty grim. And so he has to go out. All of these units have to go out, and it's multiple ones. The RAF regiment are normally the spearhead, and then when they reach stiff Japanese opposition, if they can't clear it themselves, then further reinforcements are recalled from other places. So Mehdi, the term box is a general term that is used for a surrounded locality in this theatre. The admin box battle is called that because it's one of these kinds of boxes, but it's the admin part of a division that's surrounded. But the word box is used all over the Burma campaign from the beginning of 1944, and it had been used in North Africa earlier than that as well. But in Burma, it becomes one of the central tenets that Slim has. You always have these boxes and make the Japanese attack you when it's appropriate. In this case, the speed that they need to clear the airfield every morning is they can't sit there and wait for the Japanese, but they have to go out every single day and do this. So this is one of the RAF regiment photos. There was a pagoda in the middle of it, by the way. If I go back to here, if you see where there's some dispersal areas, there's a clump of trees to the right of the little branches of dispersal areas. There is a pagoda. If you can just about see it, it's white in the middle of it, but that's actually a pagoda that was in the middle of the airstrip that the Japanese often occupied as a defensive position. Everyone got killed, and then 2 days later the Japanese are back. And so the RAF regiment, the 9th Brigade of 5th Division, have to go out and clear it. Planes are destroyed on the runway and so on. A couple of times they have to cancel all landings, so they have to fall back onto air supply, and so on. And yeah, Darren, Nigel Warwick, actually, his book Constant Vigilance is a fantastic one. If you for the RAF regiment, I spoke to Nigel about these stories, like Norman Gerish, for example. This guy, Wing Commander Bill Lander of the RAF regiment. So if anyone was on that presentation yesterday, unfortunately, you'll know that Bill Lander, with the stereotypical RAF moustache, he looks like a horrible histories character, and yet he is a fantastically inspiring commander. But his lead, he's a wing commander. He does not need to go out on these patrols. It's not really his job, and he does get killed on one of these sweeps to clear the Japanese off. But the other sort of thing I was going to mention about the battle for the airfield was the guy in the bottom right-hand corner, the medical orderly. You can see his Red Cross armband, leading aircraftman Ian Fidesz, MM 238 Squadron. He gets his MM because when this plane in the background, and these are the two pilots, Jack Creech is the one in the middle, and I can't remember the name of the pilot off the top of my head now. But what they're doing is they were about to take off. Their plane was loaded with wounded, including from Probin's, from the 255th Tank Brigade, a guy called the best tank guy's name ever. His name was I've forgotten his first name now. Fred Armour, as in literally armor of a tank. So he had to be a tank man. But he's been wounded previously. He's loaded on there, and the Japanese shell rips through the engine cowling at the top, so you can see where it's come out. And it's a Japanese anti-tank gun at the far end of the airfield. and it collapses the undercarriage, so it drops down. Everyone on board is shaken about. The plane's clearly not going anywhere. As the pilot and the co-pilot basically make the engines safe, and they do something with the fuel. They isolate the fuel tanks or something. Fidesz is rescuing the guys in the back. The Japanese begin to fire artillery at it. They see the potential here. So all of a sudden, all of the Japanese fire is drawn to this Dakota, whilst a counterattack is organised to get rid of the guns. And Fidesz is beginning to clear all of these infantry. Armour, the guy that I mentioned, a piece of shrapnel has cut through the top of his scalp, and apparently his if you imagine where I had hair, you lift it off, and it was hanging there like by the skin or something. And amazingly, this guy survives. Armour survives, having been re-wounded in this, and the top of his scalp is blown off and is basically there. That has sort of come off. So pretty grim stuff. But Fidesz not just drags them away under fire, but out of the aircraft. He then carries them individually, first to an ambulance that has come by, but then an explosion puts some shrapnel through part of it. So he then unloads the ambulance and eventually gets them into an aircraft pen a bit further away. So yeah, he's an amazing guy. The kind of story you wouldn't be surprised if it was a Victoria Cross. Actually, hopefully it was maybe a sort of a difficult one, but eventually I'll keep back on that. Actually, eventually though, in fact, I think I'll go to one of these maps for this last bit. Here we go. So eventually the Japanese, the big problem for the Japanese here really is that they can arrive and they can bother the airfield and also from elsewhere. And by the one thing I didn't mention earlier was when I mentioned all of the big guns that has been assigned to this battle, the big blue shading to the north near a place called Mingaladon Lake, between Mingaladon Lake and the North Lake, Mindorgan Lake, sorry. That's where the Japanese have all their artillery, but they constantly move them. They're never really stationary for more than a day or so. Again, to try and defend against the British, just pop up in a large area. But the thing that happens, though, is that when Cowan sends his sweeps out, every time the Japanese occupy a village or whatever, the British can turn, and the Indians can turn up at will with their tanks and artillery, kill a couple of hundred Japanese, destroy a couple more artillery guns, and then they go back into their boxes at the end of the day. And the Japanese come in, they reoccupy the place, and then the British come back and they destroy them all. The Japanese don't have an effective way of countering these tactics. And it all boils down to, and again, this is kind of my first book, it boils down to the fact that the Japanese are unable to counter those tanks. And this battle is built on the backs of tanks. The mobility that they provide to go to these villages, smash the nearest Japanese incursion, and then pull back again. And the Japanese, therefore, they're never able to really properly coordinate this battle at any point. It's never coordinated properly. The closest they do is what they do at the airfield. But that's not brilliantly coordinated with the rest of the battle. So there are times when, a tank unit that is resting and it's not on a sweep can support the airfield. So the British are always able, even though they're 80 miles behind enemy lines and they're outnumbered really after sort of the 5th or 6th of March, the Japanese never ever concentrate in one place, or they never concentrate around them and attack at once. They never get it right. You can see what they're up to, but again, this is where Cowan's defense is so perfect. The reason they can't ever do that is because they're constantly disrupted by these armored sweeps. And it doesn't matter if the Japanese reoccupy a village that they've just been killed from, been cleared from, because the tanks can just come back a day later and get rid of them again. There is nothing they can do. So being 80 miles behind the Japanese lines and surrounded, Cowan never loses the initiative at any point. He never uses it. And yeah, Trent, absolutely. The 37 and 47 millimeter anti-tank guns, that's what they were using in 1942. They have not updated them. And I think someone mentioned on the chat earlier, I didn't get to address it. Someone else mentioned a lot earlier about, where the Japanese held back like the Germans were, like they didn't have, they were running out of supplies and materials and so on. Yeah, absolutely. The American submarine blockade and also the aerial bombardment has meant that the Japanese can't develop any sort of new weapons since the sort of the late 30s and early 1940s. So they're still using these weapons. The 37 millimeter anti-tank gun was only just from the right angles, capable of destroying a Stuart. So when they come up against a Sherman, 2 generations later of tank design in World War II, they're not good enough. They're just not good enough. They have to get the Sherman tank at exactly the right angle to do any damage. Normally, they just the best they can do is to attack the suspension, the wheels, the drive sprockets. And so what that means is A, the tank is often repairable, and B, the crew's normally fine.
Yeah.
So it's not, so there's never any problems with that. So Cowan eventually has done exactly what Slim has wanted, because once Mandalay falls, and that happened 80 years ago yesterday, that was the fall of Mandalay yesterday, the 21st of March, the Slim is actually in Mandalay celebrating. When the Mandalay falls, the Japanese are now literally stuck in the open ground between Meiktila and Mandalay. 33rd Corps at Mandalay now squeezed down towards Meiktila. And, if anyone's read Defeat into Victory, which I'm sure at least a number of you have, Slim loves the hammer and anvil metaphor. He uses it about 3 different battles in the book. This is exactly what he says about Mandalay and Meiktila. He's going south from Mandalay. He squashes the Japanese, and eventually what Cowan has done at Meiktila in particular, as the Japanese have come south, all of these troops have been destroyed, and eventually the Japanese are heading wholesale for Rangoon, near enough. There is one more very sharp battle at Purebuoy, and again, if you've read Quartered Safe Out Here by George MacDonald Fraser, I've mentioned him a couple of times. It is Quartered Safe Out Here that I was referring to. He describes the Battle of Purebuoy. Very interestingly, and I do mention this in the book, there is a guy that I found on the Imperial War Museum website, a guy called Peter Hazelhurst, who was in the same company as George MacDonald Fraser, who does say that MacDonald Fraser likes to put himself in the thick of the action, and essentially accuses him of using some poetic license. It's not that the things didn't happen, and Hazelhurst says that. He doesn't say that MacDonald Fraser is wrong. It's just that he sometimes puts himself closer to the action than he actually was, but he did witness it, because it's a company action. He did witness these things. He doesn't say he's incorrect about what goes on, but him being as close to it is what he says is an exaggeration. So always interesting to hear that old soldiers who don't quite agree. But at the end of the battle, they drive for Rangoon. I'm not going to do too much about the race to Rangoon now, because because it is not really the point of the book and the battle. The race to Rangoon, the following couple of months, the Japanese are broken. I finished the book really with Purebuoy, although I do go right up to the surrender of Rangoon. But the point of it here. Now, I've given you another quote from Miles Smeaton here. So this, for me, typifies what's happened by the end of Meiktila. He says this just after Oyen, but it really applies to what's happened over the course of the war in a way. The 17th Indian Division, obviously, like I said earlier, they'd been in the retreats. They'd been in the darkest moments of this campaign. They remember how close to defeat that they got. And they've come through all of that and are there at the end. And in fact, interestingly, the 17th Indian Division were not the ones to recapture Rangoon. And many of them were really upset about that. It wounded a sense of their pride. They felt like everything they'd gone through, they should have been the ones to take Rangoon. But the monsoon started whilst they were about 50 miles away. And so an amphibious attack from Arakan finally took it at the end of April, end of April, beginning of May. And the 17th were quite upset about that. George MacDonald Fraser mentions it in his book. Pettigrew mentions it in his one as well. In Slim's hat, he wants it to look like a Gurkha hat. So the Gurkhas never used to clip, or rarely clip the side up. Okay, so he wanted it to look like a Gurkha hat. In terms of that, to the people that said that about him putting the side of his hat. But anyway, so he Slim has won his battle in here, and this quote really is what I say typifies it for me. By Meiktila 1945, the British and Indian Army have got such a hold of the Japanese army and what they've done to them that they no longer fear them. The Superman myth from 1942-1943 is truly broken. Their anguished look of determination and despair pitting their puny strength against such tremendous force. This desperate form of courage was something that we knew little of and saw with amazement, admiration, and pity. You wouldn't, like, unbelievable, 2 years earlier, the idea towards the Japanese Superman, and now these guys pity them. Incredible. So, guys, thank you so much for listening. I always love doing these. I've done a little bit better for time this time. I think I went on for a bit too long last time, but 90 minutes. I'm pretty happy with that.
No, fantastic stuff. There's a couple of questions that came up that we didn't address as you went along. So right back when you were talking about the approach, Rob Crane asked about what were the roads like in that area.
So there are a couple of metalled roads outside and going into Meiktila, but most of these are dirt tracks. Most of it is sandy dirt track, and it's a really thick, fine, powdery sort of stuff. Think desert with soft sand, but with compacted earth roads.
Okay, thank you. We also had the tanks. Were they carrying extra fuel? That was one of Trevor's questions earlier on.
They carry a small amount, but to be honest, their confidence in the air resupply is they actually don't want to get too slowed down by anything. So they carry a small amount, but it's not like when you see things like North Africa and they've got dozens of jerry cans. It's not like that.
Okay. Scott Grimwood asked about major issues with vehicle maintenance. Getting spare parts must have been difficult. I mean, just like in the ETO, the REMI and those kind of organizations have got better at their job. But is that an issue?
Not especially. They are able to parachute drop replacement parts, even whole engines and things like that. REMI and the Indian electrical mechanical engineers. They are there and they are doing their work. But generally speaking, no, they don't particularly struggle to do it.
Okay, thank you very much. Trevor also asked, was resupply by river impossible?
They were doing that on the Irrawaddy, but that's no help to the Thunder Run until after 4th Corps, 33rd Corps catch up to them.
Okay, and then Neil asked, what action did the 116th Regiment RAC Gordon Hines get involved with?
Yeah, so they're the ones who, when they're coming out of the Gangor Valley and approaching the Irrawaddy, they are the ones who basically are called upon to crack the final nut. So they're the ones that clear Pakoku. So without them, you wouldn't have the crossing of the Irrawaddy in this area. So they clear Pakoku and the area around it. And also once they're across the Irrawaddy, there is really quite fierce fighting that, with 100,000 words in the book, I couldn't really cover it. But they fight with the 7th Indian Division for the whole of this period, fighting off the Japanese 28th Army, who are also fighting in the Arakan as well, at places like, Gangor for Darren, because I know he's listening. They're fighting Gangor. The 28th Army are also counter-attacking against the 7th Indian Division from the south, and that's what the Gordon Highlanders are up to, with people like the 4th and 8th Gurkhas, Scott Gilmore, a Yankee a Yankee in the 4th and 8th Gurkhas.
Okay, thank you. And then Robert Hilton said, you mentioned 3,000 vehicles. Was it mostly tracked, or were many vehicles wheeled only? I'm assuming there are lots of soft skins and wheels.
Yeah, most of them are soft skins. Skins. There are obviously universal carriers. There's 2 regiments for tanks, plus there would be some few spares. You're talking probably a couple hundred tanks maximum. Then you've also got I think it's 16 107 millimeter Priest self-propelled guns as well. Okay,
and then the final one to bring up to date. Trevor asked again: are there any World War II memorials in the town today?
No, Meiktila very much went back to business as usual straight away afterwards. It's still a town and a bit of a sort of a supply hub, a transport hub through the whole country. But no, not particularly. But like so often in Burma, the airfield is the one that was built by the Royal Engineers. Or repaired by the Royal Engineers, I should say. The Japanese.
So finally, just a bit of housekeeping in this. The book is coming out in June, but it's pre-order now via the publishers. Is that right?
Yeah. In fact, Rob, if you want to. Paul, sorry, if you want to put the slide back up, I've got some dates on it and stuff if you put them up.
There we go.
So Forgotten Armour is already out, and I do a single chapter on the Thunder Run, but I go into significant, like nowhere near the detail, and in particular in Forgotten Armour, I only concentrate on the tank warfare side of Meiktila. So it's obviously it's only 10,000 words or so, whereas Meiktila, a Thunder Run, Meiktila 1945, is available for pre-order now. Now I put on the front there, the greatest combined arms manoeuvre battle of World War II. Obviously, a lot of contenders. I'd like to at least present to you my case.
It's a great title. And when you were talking, this has been my last comment that we were ending about that. It was an 80-mile push in there, and that you quoted the guy talking about being a cavalry charge. I wonder what people would have said who were part of 30 Corps on their way to Arnhem if it had worked, because I'm sure there were moments for those guys in the early hours when that felt like it was going to be a crusade to victory and they were excited. Of course, it didn't work that way, because this was high risk with that changing back and forth of the airfield, with if the weather had set in, or there's all sorts of ways this could have gone tits up, frankly. And it's that interesting, the way if something bold works, we give everybody the praise for it, and if something bold doesn't work, we slaughter the commanders for the rest of their lives, and the margins can be very fine, can't they?
Yeah, I mean, the thing that they had at Meiktila was that, unlike at Hell's Highway in Arnhem, is there was so much easy scope to send those tanks off of the road they were taking. They could send them 5 miles away, either side of the road whenever they wanted, and do that. And just looking at Sheldrake, Trevor, like, there is a slight bit of tongue in cheek, perhaps. But I am not. My thing is that this genuinely is what we have forgotten, just what an incredible mobile armored battle this was.
Yeah, no, absolutely.
So that I appreciate. Of course, there are loads of other battles,
but that gets people talking.
It's
it's all about getting that dialogue. So Jack, we will fit things there, folks. I'm back again tomorrow on a rare Saturday show before I go off to Guernsey for a few days with JD from History Underground, do some filming out there. So Kevin is on 4 p.m. UK time tomorrow afternoon, and we're talking about Patton and the River Rhine. So, as always, lots of quotes about what General Patton was up to. We've covered the British 130 Brigade today. We're talking about the 7th Division, American Division, last week. So we're covering that push into Germany in many different ways. Anthony Tucker-Jones is coming on in early April, talking about the German resistance to the Rhineland. But in the meantime, click like and subscribe, buy my guest books, consider becoming a patron. Thank you, Jack. Thank you, everybody. I will see you all again tomorrow. Cheers. Bye.
Thank you, guys. Cheers.